Hello, and welcome to Historical Geography in the Holy Land. In this course, we'll be covering 4 separate units. The first unit is on archaeology, geography, and people. Unit 2 will cover architecture of New Testament times. Unit 3 will focus on King Herod and the Holy Land. And the final unit will look at Jesus, his life and ministry in the areas of Galilee and Judea. The program objectives are 1, to develop your familiarity with the history of the Holy Land, to help you develop an understanding and appreciation of the people, places, culture, and society of the ancient world. And finally, by understanding all this, it'll help you to better contextualize the biblical age into personal contemporary settings. And when you talk or teach and work with other people, you can better make the Bible come alive to them by relating it from the past to the present for them. Much of our understanding of the events that have taken place in the Bible has been enhanced through biblical archaeology. The word archaeology comes from the Greek words archaeos for ancient and logos, which means discourse or word. Through the findings of excavations, biblical archaeology illuminates the books of the Old and New Testaments, providing us with knowledge on people, places, things, and events that took place during biblical times. When you visit the Holy Land and some of the ancient sites, some of the following archaeological terms will be used. Khirbet, and that refers to an ancient site in which some of the ruins are visible. For example, at Khirbet Qumran, that's where the Dead Sea Scrolls are. You can see the caves nearby, but you can also see the community that the Essenes lived in. Tel in Arabic is written with 2 L's and in Hebrew with 1, refers to an ancient site whose ruins are completely buried, and it tends to resemble a natural hill or a mesa. Now, in order to excavate in the Near East, also referred to as the Middle East, an excavator must have special permission, which is called a concession, to dig in the host country. This requires adequate funding and also a good base of volunteers. Most tells are too large to excavate completely. So generally, a surface survey is done to help you determine the best area to excavate. In other words, the area where you're most likely to make some really good findings, so you'll get the most bang for your buck. That way, when you go back to donors, you'll have better responses for your next excavation. Now, not all cities are located on tells, and that word tell translates to strength. Some cities had room to expand outward, so they're not, built on a mountain, and they're actually located on the lower ground level where we're at, so they'd be on a very similar surface soil as we are. For example, Ephesus and Rome. Cities are generally located where they are easily defendable. They have access and they have a defendable water supply. They're close to major roads, and they have good agricultural land nearby because they need a steady food supply source. So here's an example. I'm going to show you some examples of khirbets. And so the remains are visible above ground without having to do excavation. This one's getting a little bit harder to see because you have growth taking over. And here's an example of a tell. And again, it looks like a mesa or plateau. They're distinctive in the fact that they generally have these flat tops to them. And if you were to walk along the area, you might see a couple of like pot shards and small things that give you a sense that, that might be an archaeological site underneath, along with the location. This tells Shahurun. Before digging begins, a contour map is drawn and a grid system of the tell is actually drawn out. Grids are labeled and they're numbered for reference. And then when digging starts, it's done to actually excavate the strata levels. Today, most archaeologists use the bulk method. It gives the site a checkerboard appearance. It leaves about 1 meter of unexcavated earth between the squares, and that's the actual bulk, which provides a walkway and prevents the contents of the squares from getting mixed up with each other. So you're keeping every finding area pristine, so you know exactly where something came from, because different squares may represent different periods of time or different usages. One may be a bedroom, one may be a scriptorium, for example. Artifacts that are most commonly found in excavations are shards, and that's the singular for sherd. Those are broken pieces of pottery. And when a piece of pottery, this broken piece has writing on them, they're valuable, they're very exciting finds, and they're called ostraka or ostrakon. So ostrakon would be the plural. I'm sorry, the other way around. So you have an ostrakon for the singular and ostraka for plural. So there are many different methods of dating artifacts, including radiocarbon, dendrochronology, which are tree rings. However, in the Near East, pottery is actually the basic tool for dating. It has very distinct shapes for different time periods, particularly oil lamps. And then in the New Testament, another form of dating that was used, because it was quite common by then, are coins. It's very important to keep extensive records of each area that you're exploring and every level, the stratum, because that's your way of preserving human heritage. Once you've excavated, you're destroying those resources. So you want to make sure that you keep good records of it for future civilizations. So here's an example of an ostrakon. This is the contour map, so your bulk method, the grid map that you'd be developing. This is an actual excavation site, so this would be referred to as the bulk here, and they're frequently wide enough that you can actually walk along them. Here's another site with the bulk method. Ancient coins that are used for dating, different time frames. The New Testament era coin, this one has Caesar Augustus on it. Old Testament archaeology, or what we know as the Hebrew Bible period, covers approximately 1,500 years, versus the New Testament covers 50 years. So you think of the time of Jesus and the apostles. So the Hebrew Bible covers the whole Middle East and in terms of terrain, and then the New Testament is limited to the Mediterranean area. Now, out of the 5,000 sites in the Holy Land, only about 200 of them have actually been excavated. If you want to dig for a site mentioned in the Bible, you need to know the geographic location, the linguistic name, both in the past as it was in the Bible and also now in the present, and if there's any evidence of archaeological remains. Is there anything above ground? So here you have a map which would reference what we refer to as the New Testament periods, those areas where Jesus and the apostles moved. Geography in the land of Canaan, Israel. It's important to understand the geography in order to fully appreciate the works of the Bible. Israel is a small land area. Abraham was promised the land from Dan to Beersheba, which is about 150 miles. And it's an area full of contrasts. It includes 3 climate zones: Mediterranean, steppe, which is prairie or semi-desert, and the desert. In general, Israel has a moderate climate. January is the coldest month, about 46 degrees, and the summer rarely gets above 90 degrees. It has 2 seasons, either rainy or dry. And when the Bible speaks of early rains, these are the rains that begin before October, and later rains refer to those that are lasting until May. Dewfall is significant because it provides moisture in a dry season, and generally it's fairly dry in this part of the world. And we have references to dewfall when we think of the miracles in the story of Gideon and the fleece, which we find in the book of Judges, chapter 6, verses 36 through 40. The land is divided into 4 different topographic zones. So we have the Jordan Valley, the Eastern Plateau, the hill country, and the coastal plains. So here we have a topo map of Israel. So you see the Transjordan Plateau, the Jordan Valley, the Central Mountain areas, and the coastal plains. The Jordan Valley has the Jordan River and 3 lakes, dividing Israel into 2 parts. Lake Hula during the Bible times was about 4 miles long and 2 miles wide. It's been drained extensively, so not as large as it was back then. 10 miles further, we find the Sea of Galilee. And in the Hebrew Bible, there are many different names for the Sea of Galilee, including the Sea of Chinnereth. The Jordan River drops 700 feet at that point, and the Sea of Galilee measures approximately 13 miles long and 7.5 miles wide. In some places, it's nearly 200 feet deep. As we continue further on through the Jordan Valley, the river drops another 600 feet until it finally arrives at the Dead Sea. So the Jordan River meanders about 200 miles between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. And that area was referred to as the Jungle of Jordan. We find a reference to that in Zechariah chapter 11, verse 3, because in the ancient times, it was a heavily treed and forested area. And then the Jordan River finally empties its fresh water into the Dead Sea, also referred to as the Salton Sea in Genesis 14, chapter 14, verse 3. So the Dead Sea is approximately 46 miles long and about 10 miles wide, and it's a fairly desolate and barren land area. So here you have the location of the 3 lakes, Lake Hula, the Sea of Galilee, and the Dead Sea. Another close-up of the Sea of Galilee and some of the key sites that we know Jesus traveled around, including Capernaum. A view of the Sea of Galilee. You can see the difference as you travel around the Sea of Galilee in terms of what the land is around it. This area is much drier than the previous one, where you see a lot more greening. Here we have an image of the Jordan River, and it certainly does meander. Parts of it are nice and smooth, as we see here, and parts of it are rushing with rapids. This aerial shot is very clear in terms of when I mentioned meandering. And so what we can understand from the Jordan River is, unlike what we see in Egypt with the Nile and in other parts of the Middle East with the Tigris and Euphrates, the Jordan River is not something that is easily navigable. In fact, you can't navigate the entire distance. We have the barrenness of the Dead Sea with its high mineral and salt contents. Dead Sea has been heavily mined by both Israel and Jordan. A lot of different countries vying for the minerals within the Dead Sea caused quite a bit of retraction of the water levels. So hotels that used to be based right along it because of the evaporation have actually, now you have to travel quite a bit to get down there. The Eastern Plateau, which is also called the Transjordan, is an area of hills, plains, and valleys. Biblical Bashan is located at its north end. It has a very fertile plain and is famous for the raising of cattle, sheep, and it has many oak trees. You see references, we hear about references to biblical Bashan in Deuteronomy, in Psalms, and also in the book of Isaiah. This area is now referred to as the Golan Heights. It's also called Gilead in the Bible, and that refers to all those territories east of the Jordan River. Moses gave the Eastern Plateau to the tribes of Gad, Reuben, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Again, we see that reiterated in the book of Joshua, chapter 13, verse 8. So here you have some images of the Eastern Plateau area. Again, it's rather hilly, but it's got valleys and it's lush. The hill country is divided into three parts. The northern area begins just above Tyre and extends southward to the valley of Esdraelon. This is called Galilee. The mountains are very high. It has a very fertile valley area. And the flat terrain of that particular valley that's found there was also a staging area for many battles that we find in the Hebrew Bible. The central part of the hill country, Samaria, is referred to as the breadbasket. The southern hill country, which is slightly north of Jerusalem to the region of Hebron, is called Judea. And it's a land of rocky slopes, terraced for vineyards and orchards. Here we've got Samaria, Judea, Galilee. South of Hebron, the hill country gives way to the Negev, home for part of the patriarchal period. And this is an area known for being a marginal agricultural zone. It can support a large population if it's well managed. Two other terms which are frequently associated with the hill country is the wilderness of Judah, and that's the barren area that runs along the Dead Sea, and also the term Shephelah, which refers to the foothills between the hill country and the coastal plains. So here we've got the hill country of Judah, and right along here we have the wilderness of Judah, and then we have the Shephelah. And you can see this shepherd is managing his flocks, quite green, and in the background, you can see the agriculture going on, harvesting. And then you have this barren wilderness of Judea here, mountainous area, where many stories in the Hebrew Bible are spoken about. We think about King David when he was fleeing from King Saul and hiding in the mountainous region. This terrain made it quite possible for the Hebrews to exist and fight back and remain hidden when the enemies came into their territory, because they knew all the valleys and the caves in the area. The barren Negev. You can see the foothills of the Shephelah. There's another image of the wilderness of Judah. The coastal plain is a sandy area of about 12 miles long from Gaza to Joppa, and today it's referred to as Tel Aviv. The plain itself was called Philistia and was home of the Philistines. The plain of Sharon begins at Joppa and ends north of Caesarea, which was built in New Testament times. The Bible refers to this area as the Rose of Sharon, and we see that referenced in the Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 1. And the majesty of Sharon, which is referenced in the prophet Isaiah's book, chapter 35, verse 2. And that references the mighty forest that grew here during Hebrew times of the Bible. So here you have the image of the coastal plain. So what are the effects of geography? They're significant. We talked about the river systems, for example. The civilizations of both Mesopotamia and Egypt grew up around river systems, which actually brought people together to work cooperatively. We have the Nile and the Tigris and Euphrates. However, in Israel, there's no such unifying river system. The Jordan meanders. It's not actually used for irrigation extensively, and so it doesn't create a common bond for the people. In fact, the topography of Israel is such that it actually isolates people with its many mountains and valleys, and of course the meandering Jordan River. However, Israel is a land bridge between Mesopotamia and Egypt. It's an area where many cultures crossed and armies marched through on their way to the Mediterranean. They're heading toward the port cities of Tyre and Sidon, and it's also a caravan traveling route. As a result, there's very little opportunity for the land there to develop its own identity. The topography is varied, it's not always desirable. The wealthy had resorts and the poor struggled, and we see that mentioned by the prophet Amos in chapter 3, verses 15. So the wealthy would have multiple houses, some along the coastlines, some along the mountains, and the poor struggled where they were at. The topography also explains biblical references to going up to Jerusalem or down to Jericho, again, referencing the mountains and the valleys. So anyone moving into Israel from Mesopotamia or Egypt would have to make some major lifestyle adjustments. For example, Abraham came from flatlands and from the city of Ur, where the Tigris and the Euphrates are, with water transportation options, which are not available in Israel. And also the weather would have been different and new to him. So this difficult topography of Israel leads one to dream of a country which is far easier to traverse. And we see this in Isaiah's reference, which would make sense to the people listening because they understood what their land was like. So we look at the prophet Isaiah's woe cry in chapter 40, verses 3 through 4. So here we have Israel as the land bridge, as people, as different cultural groups and nations are trying to get to Sidon and Tyre, which are the port cities to the Mediterranean. And then you see the red lines here, which are caravan routes. So all of which is traipsing through the land of Israel. So we'd have the Babylonians and the Assyrians. Even before then, we had the Sumerians and the Hittites, and of course you have the Egyptians. So in terms of a general review, we think about all the different people and the time frames and the effect they had on the Holy Land and on the Israelites. We have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. They travel from the Ur of the Chaldeans in the area of Sumeria by the Tigris and the Euphrates, up to Haran, and then where Abraham gets the call of the monotheistic God, and so begins the journey of the patriarchs as they travel through the Promised Land into Egypt. And so we have these stories of their movements in and out and back and forth, and their very human lives that they list. Then at the end of Genesis, we close with Joseph in Egypt, and everything seems relatively good for the Hebrew people as they settle in the Nile Delta area. However, by the time we open up in Exodus, things have changed dramatically. They've gone from a free people to becoming the slaves of the Egyptians. And so Moses is called by God to free his chosen people, and he leads them out of the rich Nile Delta area along the Exodus into the Sinai Peninsula, where the wilderness wanderings take place, until they finally, after 40 years, make it to the Promised Land, and then begins their travels into the land of Canaan as they claim it as Israel. So once they settle into the land of Canaan, which has now become for them Israel, we have the period of Judges, which reflects the 12 tribes. They're not unified at this time. There are 12 independent tribes living through a land which we saw earlier is very geographically and topographically different. So it doesn't cause a sense of unity. The tribes act independently, sometimes falling away from God, sometimes falling into subjugation to other peoples and tribes that come in. Until finally, we enter the period of the United Kingdom. The people cry out and feel that if they have a king, it would unite them so that they could stand as one against these invading peoples that come into their territory of the Promised Land. So we began with King Saul, followed by King David, and ending with Solomon. And the stories of the kings again reflect human nature. Saul begins out as a good king with a heart for God and then falls away and is replaced by God's anointed King David. And King David has a good heart, but he has strong tendencies to fall into areas of temptation along with his family. And so the stories are very human. They relate to us: lust, greed, rape, all of the difficult aspects of human nature versus this longing for God, which David continues to show and are reflected in his Psalms. King Solomon falls the furthest away from God by the close of his reign. He has over 1,000 women in his harem, and he's led astray because many of these women come from different cultures and have different religious practices. So after King Solomon, his son, wasn't able to keep the kingdom united, he wanted to continue taxing the people, and they'd gotten tired of the incredible burden of the taxes to maintain households such as Solomon with 1,000 women and their extensive horses. And so they split. They split into the northern kingdom, which had 10 of the tribes, and the southern kingdom, which has 2 of the tribes. The northern kingdom will eventually fall to the Assyrian Empire in 721 BC. They had fallen far away from God, and when they do fall to the Assyrians move them throughout the empire, replacing them with other peoples. That's known as a diaspora, and those 10 tribes later become known as the lost 10 tribes of Israel. Because of the way the kingdoms were divided, the northern kingdom didn't have the holy city of Jerusalem, so it made 2 separate religious sanctuaries, one at Bethel and one at Dan, placed golden calves in front of them, which caused the priests to become very upset and calling it blasphemous. So the Levitical priests left and stayed in southern Judah. Without a religious group to lead the people, the kings of northern Israel replaced the priesthood with one of their own, many of whom tended to follow the pagan and cultic ways. So when that northern kingdom fell to Assyria, they didn't have any Levitical priests moving with them to keep the people focused and united in terms of their monotheistic faith. The southern kingdom continues the line of King David. So you have many good kings and some very bad kings, but in general, they tended to stay monotheistic and focused on the one God. And of course, they had the temple in Jerusalem, the holy city. They eventually fall to the Babylonian Empire, and they experienced 3 periods of exile. The Babylonians were very specific on who they wanted when they moved the people out of Jerusalem. They focused on the rich, the educated, and the craftsmen and the merchants, because they used them in their empire. Eventually, the Babylonian Empire fell to the Persian Empire, and it's under Cyrus the Great, also known as Darius the Mede, and the Cyrus cylinder, that a decree is put out for the peoples of the empire to be allowed to go back to their homelands and practice their culture and their faith. So this was a wonderful time of rejoicing and a fulfillment of prophecy, because they were able to return from exile to the land God promised them, rebuild Jerusalem, and rebuild the temple. So then begins the second temple period, and this rebuilding is led by Ezra and Nehemiah. After the Persian Empire, we'll find that it lasted a long time until it finally fell to Alexander the Great. At that point, we have Greek, Egyptians, and Syrians invading into the area of what was known as Israel. Eventually, there's a time period when revolt takes place and the Israelites are able to claim back Israel for a short period of time under the Maccabean rule until they finally fall to the Roman Empire. So you can see that the peoples of the Holy Land are varied, and not only that, but the Israelites have been subjected to a myriad of cultures and beliefs, and yet despite all this, they maintain their belief in the one monotheistic God. So here we have an image of the Assyrian Empire. It's in the 8th century that the Northern Kingdom falls to the Assyrians and they get displaced throughout this empire, and we have the loss of the 10 tribes of Israel. Assyrian rule was very harsh. They did allow for some vassal states, and southern Judah, the southern kingdom, Judah, actually became a vassal state under Assyrian rule. So this image shows a king bowing down in homage to the Assyrians, one of the vassal kings. The Babylonian Empire is even more extensive than the Assyrians, and it's under the Babylonians that the southern kingdom, Judah, will fall, and will have 3 periods of diaspora, of exile, many of the Jews being settled in Babylon. And the priesthood goes with them and maintains the faith with promises of prophecies that God will bring them back to the promised land. God will not forget his covenant people. An image of Babylonian captivity, and these are wall reliefs found at ancient sites. The Persian Empire, as you can see, the empires just continue growing under Cyrus the Great, and it's during this time that God works through his anointed Cyrus, who's a pagan, which shows us that God is inclusive in who he reaches out to and uses for his own purposes. And at this point, the Hebrews are allowed to come back and rebuild the city of Jerusalem and establish themselves in Israel once again. In order to maintain such a vast empire, because obviously they didn't have internet, cell service, or any of the things that we have today, Cyrus developed an extensive road system which allowed for correspondence to go back and forth quickly, which helped maintain notification of any problems of rebellions or anything, which is how he was able to maintain this vast empire. And he had little governors in all the different places, including in Israel. His road system was set up so that at every 10-mile intervals, they would change out the horses. And so it was the beginning of the postal service, because letters were able to, and communication was able to travel quickly back and forth along the royal roads. Images from the Persian Empire. By New Testament times, the people of Israel had been subjected to a variety of rulers and cultures. After the defeat of the Persian Empire by Alexander the Great of Greece, a process of change begins to occur throughout the Near East. The common language of Aramaic begins to be replaced with Greek, linking the Near East with the Mediterranean world. Also, Greek culture begins to spread eastward. Hellenism begins to create uniformity in lifestyles, unlike the Persians, who encouraged subjects to retain their identity, religion, and culture. So a very different response. The intertestamental times. This is a time between what we refer to as the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible and the New Testament times. So that intertestamental period before the coming of Jesus. Persian rule continues for quite some time. And during this period of time, we have the Persians coming up against the expanding Greek Empire. So first we have Philip of Macedon, who is the father of Alexander the Great, and he gets into battles with King Artaxerxes III of Persia. Finally, Alexander the Great comes into his own power, and he's able to successfully defeat King Darius III of Persia. He uses gold coins to bribe the people and the army of King Darius. In 332 BCE, Israel and the Jewish population fall to Greek control. They're no longer under Persian control. Alexander goes on from there to conquer Egypt, and he now becomes known as Alexander the Great, and it is the end of the Persian Empire. And then, strangely enough, Alexander, at the young age of 32, gets sick and dies. The year is now 323 BCE. The changes that occur in the Near East during this time with Alexander's conquest are significant. Aramaic is replaced with Greek, which becomes the common language linking the Near East and the Mediterranean world, and Greek culture begins now to spread eastward. Hellenism, the term for Greek culture, begins to create a uniformity in lifestyle versus what the Persians had encouraged in their subjects, which was to retain their identity and religion. So a very different style of overseeing the empire. So this is the extent of the reign of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great's death results in a power struggle among his generals. One general, Seleucus, takes power in southern Mesopotamia. And so he shifts his base southward and is the founder of Antioch of the New Testament, the references that we see in the New Testament to that particular Antioch. Another general, Ptolemy, takes command of Egypt. The south of Israel is now ruled by Ptolemy, and the north is ruled by the Seleucids of Syria, and both parties want Israel, again, because of its land bridge location. The Ptolemies continue the previous Persian policy of religious freedom, and the Greeks, the Seleucids, however, take a different approach. They figure everyone wants to be like them. Many of the Jews that remained under the Seleucid control like and adopt these Hellenistic ways. Meanwhile, in the southern part where the Ptolemies are, Ptolemy II commissions a Greek translation of the Old Testament, which became known as the Septuagint, because many Jews no longer spoke Hebrew, and they were all about keeping people's culture and their religions. Jews who remained in Israel, some of them resist this cultural change of everything Hellenistic, but there's an increasing number of immigrants coming in, so there's a lot of pressure and tension resulting from this. The Seleucids in Syria are trying to annex Israel. So the result is that the Jews left in Israel are split. Some are pro-Seleucid and some are pro-Ptolemaic. The struggle for control of Alexander's empire after his death. So this map gives you a good reflection of what takes place. So General Seleucus, the Seleucids, you see the green here, takes power in southern Mesopotamia. And again, he's the founder of the Antioch that we find referred to in the New Testament. General Ptolemy takes command of Egypt. Then the Ptolemaic rule of Israel, when they had control of it, was one of continuing that Persian policy of religious freedom and not to force any new cultures on the people of that territory. And so they're constantly vying with the Seleucids for control of Israel. So Israel is like torn between the two. It goes back and forth, back and forth. Many Jews do take up Hellenistic ways, and Jews that are located in Egypt are actually treated as full citizens. Ptolemy II, as I mentioned earlier, commissioned that Greek translation of the Old Testament of the Septuagint, which is something that is used extensively in the New Testament and in the early church in terms of the stories of the Hebrew Bible. Jews who remain in Israel are close to Jerusalem, and they tend to be very resistant to Greek influence. So you have these different contingents within Israel area. Also, you find a change in the structure of the city plan. In the ancient world, the marketplace was by the city gate, but under Hellenism, the marketplace location moves from the gate to the center of the city. So you see Hellenistic influence throughout the culture. It's found in the architecture, the art, the language, and also the practice of worshiping the dead. The Seleucid rule of Palestine, of Israel, located in Syria, again, they try to annex Israel. A battle takes place at the Sea of Galilee. And finally, the Seleucids are able to defeat the Ptolemaics and now have full control of Israel. So now follows a series of several kings of the differing kings that the Israelites are subjected to under Seleucid rule. King Antiochus III is all about supporting the religious freedom of the Jews. So he's good. He issues, a proclamation for that. The Rosetta Stone, which was discovered later in the 19th century, is how we're able to understand this language because of the different languages that were on it, both Egyptian and hieroglyphics. And so they would put these different languages on because, again, they're talking to many different civilizations and cultures and peoples. And so by breaking the one language, they were able to actually then translate both the Egyptian cuneiform and the hieroglyphics by the finding of that Rosetta Stone. And so that helps us understand what the decrees were of King Antiochus III. Then Antiochus ends up losing a battle against Rome, and he has to pay this huge tribute to the Romans. And so he turns around and he takes out his anger on Jews. So from being pro-Jewish, he becomes anti-Jewish. Then he's replaced by King Antiochus IV, and this particular ruler, he's willing to actually take money for those Jews seeking the high priesthood position. So it's no longer by being a Levite, but if you had enough money, it becomes a political position. And this results in angering many of the pious Jews. So King Antiochus IV, he now attempts to conquer Egypt and fails, and Rome becomes even more angry. And so Antiochus IV takes out his frustration again on the Jews. And he attacks the city of Jerusalem. He ransacks the temple. He desecrates the temple area. And then we have this intensive religious persecution of the Jewish people. So here we have a grotto in Antioch of Syria, St. Peter's Grotto's Church. You can see some of the architecture and the building and how people took advantage of the cliffs around them. The result of the cruelty of Antiochus IV is the Jews rebel, and the rebellion is known as the Maccabean Revolt. It's named after the father and the sons who instigated the rebellion. It was a form of Jewish warfare, guerrilla warfare. The Jews, the Maccabees, were able to reclaim Jerusalem, and they cleansed the temple, and the result of this victory becomes known as Hanukkah. The Hasmoneans are the descendants of the Maccabees, and so they're seeking political and religious freedom. So this is a short period of time when Israel is once again an independent nation, and it'll be the last time until the end of World War II that they have this level of freedom. Even though they have control of Israel, there are still struggles and tensions between the Seleucids and the Jews. The Jews who are against Hellenism form a pious movement called the Hasidic movement. And the Hasidics actually revolt against the Seleucids, and later on they'll also break from the Maccabees. Then in 160 BCE, a group calling themselves the Pharisees will split away from the Hasidic movement. In 129 BCE, the Hasmoneans under the ruler John Hyrcanus actually managed to free Israel totally from Seleucid control. And so we have a true Jewish leader in charge of Jerusalem. And John Hyrcanus turns around and destroys Samaria and the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim, because it was considered an abomination to the Jewish people in regards to how the Samaritans took the Jewish faith and rewrote it in their minds and created this separate temple area on Mount Gerizim. So we have arguments, however, that take place between the Hasmoneans and the Pharisees, because the Pharisees are demanding that the priesthood be returned to the Sadducees. The argument actually also marks the beginning of the Pharisees as becoming a political party. Now, all of these names you're seeing here, the Hasidic movement, the Pharisees, are terms and groups that we'll see taking key roles in the New Testament, that they are all coming into play and being born during this intertestamental period of time. The next ruler after John Hyrcanus is Alexander Jannaeus, and he's a very brutal and cruel ruler who dies, and so the place, Israel, is now left to the control of his widow, Alexandra. The widow, Alexandra, supports the Pharisees, and so she allows them to be entered into the Sanhedrin Jewish High Court. So now we have Pharisees within the Jewish High Court. After Alexandra dies, there's quite a bit of turmoil, so much so that finally Rome steps in, and that is the end of the Hasmonean monarchy and the end of Jewish rule. So Israel won't be an independent state again until after World War II. We now have the Roman rule of Israel. It begins in 63 BCE with the general Pompey entering into Jerusalem. So Judea now becomes part of the Roman province of Syria-Palestine. There are many benefits from Roman rule. We have roads, we have aqueducts, we have beautiful buildings, and we have that sense of peace, Pax Romana, because there was no other civilization large enough to go up against the Roman Empire. So here you have the extent of the Roman Empire. All of this is coming in play, setting the stage for the time of Jesus Christ that we have in the New Testament. Then in 47 BCE, we have an Idumean named Antipater coming into play, and he's all about supporting the Romans. He's able to convince the Nabateans, who are in control of the spice trade and the caravan routes, to not fight with the Romans, but instead pay tribute to them. And Rome is so pleased with the results that Antipater was able to obtain this concession and agreement from the Nabateans that they're now willing for him to become ruler of Judea. General Pompey, who became emperor, is murdered in 48 BCE, and he's replaced with Julius Caesar. Antipater continues to cater to the Romans. He now helps Julius Caesar with a rebellion in Egypt by sending 3,000 Jewish troops down there to Egypt. And the event was successful. And as a result, Caesar shows his gratitude by exempting Antipater from taxation and making him a Roman citizen. And now he appoints him governor of Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. Antipater, to secure his position, appoints his son Phasael ruler of Jerusalem, and Herod governor of Galilee. Phasael gets murdered, and Herod has problems with bandits, particularly the Jewish zealots, the freedom fighters. He actually catches them and executes them, and then the Sanhedrin gets up in arms and protests. However, Rome supports Herod. Why? Because he's a Roman citizen. In 44 BCE, Julius Caesar is murdered, and Antipater is poisoned. And now Herod is chosen to govern Judea. He's also strategically placed himself so that he's good friends with Antony and Octavian. So here we have the areas Galilee, Samaria, and Judea. The Parthians invade Israel, and Herod then flees to Rome to ask for assistance against the Parthians. And while he's in Rome, he's crowned king of Judea by Antony and Octavian. And then in 37 BCE, Rome sends troops and reclaims Jerusalem for Herod. Herod then marries a Hasmonean princess, Marmione, which makes him now part of the royal Jewish family. Remember, the Hasmonean line is part of that Maccabee bloodline. So we now have, at the end of the closing of that intertestamental period, Herod on the throne. And his reign can be divided into 3 phases. Phase 1 covers the years of 37 to 30 BCE, and it's a time of consolidation. Herod gets rid of any potential forces or groups or individuals who might come against him. So he's consolidating his power. Then in phase 2, the years 30 to 15 BC, it's a peaceful time frame. And during this period, Herod earns his title Herod the Great because of his extensive building projects throughout the land. In phase 3, 15 to 4 BCE, the Herod's reign is one which is spotted with incidents of domestic problems, plots and counterplots. He becomes very concerned and frightened that people are trying to overthrow them. In fact, he accuses 2 of his sons of treasons, and both are strangled. Another son is actually put to death for plotting to secure his crown. So a very difficult time. In conclusion, what we have then, when we think about that intertestamental period, it's a time of political change for Israel, from Persian to Ptolemaic to Seleucid to Hasmonean, and then finally to Roman rule. Many tensions that are created among the various Jewish factions become evident in the New Testament time. So you can see the beginnings of this and what leads to what we see Jesus facing in the New Testament period when he's dealing with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, and then of course the Romans. So the Holy Land is a land of mixed people. We have Jews, we have Romans, we have Greeks, we have immigrant populations moving into the area from throughout the extensive Roman Empire. It's a multicultural environment in which Jewish society is frequently at odds. Some questions for reflection include, the first one being, what influence does geography have on civilization? Think about the following items: location, water, and topography. And looking back on the many rulers and cultures that the Jewish people were subjected to, how and why did they manage to survive? And that brings to conclusion our first lecture in regards to the Holy Man series.